Yep, you guessed it. Guys, the only thing that you need from this lesson is what you already saw on the thumbnail, what you have in front of you. Whenever you get an isolated queen pawn, all I need you to do is apply these 4 steps and you should be okay. The only other thing that we need to do in this lesson is see how elite players like Botvinnik and others use these same steps to win their game. So we're just going to review 2, 3 games, not entirely. There's only one that I want to analyze from beginning to end. The other 2 is just for you to see, to reinforce these ideas. Now, there are a few things that I wanted to say before we get started, but in the meantime, take a look at this position in front of you and see if you can find a very powerful move, a tactic that the white pieces did to win material. Take as long as you need. If you want to pause a video, but give it 5 to 10 minutes because these kind of positions, guys, playing with the isolated queen pawn requires a tactical approach. You have to be aggressive, you have to be energetic, and this is going to be good practice anyways. If you find the answer, let me know in the comments because I'm interested to know if you guys are ready for this or not at this point in the course. Now, before I tell you the answer, before we go into the games, let me tell you, you know that we already learned how to play against the isolated queen pawn on lesson 101. If you haven't, you guys got to go back and review that. Now, why are we talking about this now on lesson 153? Well, last lesson, we learned how to play the English opening. Next lesson, I told you, we're going to start going deeper into the Sicilian defense. And guys, we got to go over the open Sicilian, which is the main one that I want to teach you, but also all of the anti-Sicilian systems, including the Alapin, the closed Sicilian, and many of those systems, they include the isolated pawn. But ultimately, the reason why I wanted to have this lesson is because if you are like me, the moment you hear you have to play with the isolated pawn, you're going to freak out. And just to give you an example, let me quickly go here, guys, to show you something that happened to me when I started. When I first started playing, taking openings more seriously, I started playing e4, right? And I had to have a line against the Sicilian defense. What did I choose? Well, I chose the Alapin. Very nice opening. If you have never tried it, take a look at it because I think you might find it interesting. Now, the Alapin, you could play it with c3 right away, or you could do knight f3 and then pawn to c3. I chose to just do c3, and then there was this line where they did d5, pawn takes, queen takes, d4, and the black pieces could simply take and leave me with an isolated pawn. So I put some resistance, but then I got so many nice games applying these 4 steps. And it definitely made me more comfortable with isolated pawn for whenever I play this variation. But also, the most important thing is that regardless of the openings that you play, regardless of your style, you never know when you're going to get an isolated queen pawn. And when it happens, you need to know how to apply it. So with that said, guys, let me show you the move that Botvinnik did in this position. And then we're going to go back for you to see how he got from the opening to this middle game position where he had this nice tactic. So the move here has to do with the fact that the queen is putting pressure on the rook, and I know that the rook is defended, but that's where everything starts. Knight f7 has to be a candidate move. I'm pretty sure you looked at bishop takes, it's a capture, knight f7, bishop d5, even rook f6 we have to consider. But then after knight f7, notice how when the rook takes, then this rook is going to be hanging. So we just need to find a way to remove the rook, and that could be with some sort of capture. Of course, you also have to calculate what to do if the king takes instead. Now, let's start with what happened in the game. So knight f7 was played, hitting the queen, rook takes, and now bishop takes f6. They have to take back, and now my rook could take one of these 2 pieces. Of course, he went for the knight, hitting the queen, and now my bishop is ready to act on that diagonal. At this point, the black pieces move the queen, but they make sure to continue to defend the rook. And now, don't forget, whenever there's a defender to a piece that we want to capture or a square that we want to go to, we need to think of deflection, eliminating that piece, obstruction, all of that. And in this case, the move was rook to d6, making the queen leave, and that way we could collect on c8, right? So instead, we have queen e8, and then what do we do when we have a pinned piece? Well, we want to add more pressure to it, right? And in this case, rook d7 is the move. That's it. I'm threatening bishop takes, rook takes, and there's nothing they could do. So at this point, the black pieces, of course, resigned. But guys, like I said before, let me go all the way back to show you how they got to this position. So basically, notice how the game starts with c4. If you already went over our latest lesson, you should remember the games that we saw played by Botvinnik with the English, right? So in fact, the variation that we learned was the variation with the Botvinnik triangle. So if you haven't, take a look at it. But anyhow, in this game, after e6, we got knight f3, d5, and quickly we transposed into the Queen's Gambit. We also have a lesson. We also have a lesson on the Queen's Gambit. So knight f6, knight c3, just developing our pieces, controlling the center, and getting ready to castle. Nothing extraordinary. All of this is theory, very well known at this point. And after bishop d3, c5. Guys, when we talked about the Kali, not only did I teach you the Kali, the theory, but I took a moment to show you the pawn structure without the pieces. So we removed all of the pieces and I told you what you should be looking for. And whenever you have this kind of tension in the center with pawns, you should know different kind of pawn structures could arise. For example, we could leave them with hanging pawns. We should know how to play against them and with them. We also could get isolated pawns. And in this game, that's exactly what happened. So we have castle, c takes d4. Now, if I don't want to keep an isolated pawn, I should take with the knight, right? Because then they take and I don't have an isolated pawn. Instead, Botvinnik decided to just take with the pawn and accept the isolated pawn. Now, from this moment on, we're going to apply these 4 steps. I'm going to try not to simplify the game because this isolated pawn is going to be a liability as I get closer to the end game. So simplification is out of the equation for me. I need to keep the pieces to not only avoid that endgame where I'm going to have the weak pawn, but also this pawn requires me to be energetic and attack. So I need to keep my pieces on the board. Also, I need to occupy c5 and e5. So typically you're going to see the knights going to those outposts. And then since this is an isolated pawn, that means there are no friendly pawns on the other files, on the files next to him. So I'm going to use those files for my rooks to be energetic, to attack. And then ultimately, if they let me, I'm going to do d5. For the most part, my opponent is going to be controlling that square right in front of it to prevent me from doing it. But that's okay if we manage to take advantage of the placement of our pieces. So knight b6, this bishop, I want to keep it on this diagonal. So I go back. And remember, the bishop on this diagonal, c4, b3, a2, is mainly to get ready for that advance, right? So bishop d7, then queen d3, we talked about this. The idea mainly is to bring a rook behind it and support that d5. But also, guys, sometimes you're going to see the bishop going to c2, very nice battery. You could use that. So now we have knight d5, creating that blockade in front of the isolated pawn. That's fine. And now, guys, look at this. My bishop already on this diagonal. My queen is on d3. My knight is now going to occupy that square. Very important. That pawn is offering us a very good outpost for the knight. We cannot forget that. After knight e5, bishop c6, well, now it is time to improve my rooks. You could put the rooks on the open file, semi-open file, or simply behind the pawn to protect it, but also to get ready to advance the pawn. So knight b4, the queen is going to swing to the king side because remember, if I have a knight on an outpost, and guys, we've talked about this so many times in this course, I have the knight in the outpost. It's not like I got the knight there, I won the game. You have to now utilize that knight. And more specifically, you got to pay attention to the squares that the knight is controlling. In this case, I'm not concerned about the queen side because their king is on the king side. So I need to find ways to hit f7, do something with g6, even do something with the f pawn to open up the rook to also help out. So the knight in its base of operations is going to help us. But if we don't use its help, it's like we don't have it, right? So at this point, the queen went to h3, and you could even think of something like rook e1, knight f7, followed by queen e6. Of course, it doesn't work now, but it's something that we got to keep in mind. Now, after bishop d5 with the black pieces, we decide not to let go of our bishop. Look at how powerful it is on that diagonal. Even though it doesn't look like it, it could become very powerful at some point, either that diagonal or even c2, h7. So instead, we take with the knight, and then after knight takes on d5, it is time to evaluate the position, reassess, make sure that we have a solid plan. And guys, it's the same thing that we had before. We just need to continue to be energetic. Again, if we stay quiet, there's not going to be any initiative and it's hard to justify the isolated pawn. So what do? Well, I have my knight on e5. I need to be energetic and create more threats. So f4, trying to activate this rook, then rook c8, f5, and after pawn takes, this rook all of a sudden becomes very powerful. If you remember on lesson 107, we talked about the importance of not only focusing on rooks being on open files, but also open ranks. And in this case, this rook could do either. So after rook f5, we got queen d6, and now, guys, is when the tactic came to happen. So all of my pieces are so active. Look at this bishop, look at the other bishop, look at the knight in the center, the rook is active, and my queen is on h3. Even this rook that is not really being aggressive is doing something. And if you didn't post the video before, then this is a good time to do it. I know that you already know the answer because I showed you, but guys, it doesn't hurt to pause the video and try to visualize everything in your head, even if you know the answer. So here, one more time, we got knight f7, rook takes, bishop f6, bishop takes, and then rook d5. At this point, I'm hitting the queen, I'm hitting the rook, they moved, and then rook d6, deflection. They tried to hold on to the rook, but then rook d7, simple and decisive. So at this point, the black pieces resigned. Now, guys, the other two games that I'm going to show you, I'm not going to show you the entire thing, but it's just for you to see the same elements, the same steps taken by the person with the isolated pawn. So next position we have here, notice how the white pieces have the same isolated queen pawn. The knight managed to get to e5, the rook is on the semi-open file, and the other rook is on d3. Notice how here, not only is the rook defending the pawn, but it went to the third rank to do the rook lift, rook rollover. And of course, we are putting pressure, we are attacking thanks to the benefits of having the isolated pawn. If you have the isolated pawn and you stay quiet, you're going to transition into an endgame where you're going to be in trouble. So let me go back here and notice how, look, this bishop was on this diagonal, then went to a2, putting pressure on d5, and then after rook d8, rook d1, bishop e8, rook d3, the black pieces simply took on c3 because of the pressure that we have. And I know that you guys are gonna find this uncomfortable, but if I flip the board and you look at this position from black's perspective, you have to agree that it is uncomfortable. Or rather be the white pieces with the isolated pawn, just to not have all of this pressure that the black pieces have. So they felt like they wanted, or they needed to take on c3. We take, and all of a sudden, I don't get the isolated pawn anymore. Of course, I have the one on a3, but guys, there's so much pressure that it is hard for them to actually take advantage of that pawn. And just to show you the next move here for the black pieces, the next move was knight d5, just trying to simplify pieces and get into that end game. That's the best thing you could do if you're being attacked. Now, this game, I'm not going to show you the remaining of it, but feel free to take these names and you're going to find the game online somewhere, right? Now, the last game is going to be, I put it in here because it's very interesting. Notice here how the same thing. We have Tigran Petrosyan playing as the black pieces. He accepted the isolated pawn, and notice how his bishop is, look, this is the battery that I told you before, right? You could have the bishop on b3 trying to make this work, or you could have it on this diagonal. The rook on the semi-open file, my knight ready to get to e5, and if I wanted to get rid of my isolated pawn, I could do knight e5, knight takes, pawn takes, and the pawn is fixed, right? Now, this game I put it in here for you to see what he did thanks to this battery. So he realized the knight is pretty much tied up to the defense of that pawn. So he decided to do pawn to d5, offering the pawn for free, because now my opponent has the isolated pawn, but more importantly, I'm going to follow with bishop g5, ready to capture, and then checkmate. And of course, this is not about the simple checkmate threat. It's more about for you to consider that sometimes you could let go of the pawns for free if that's going to give you an energetic play, is going to allow you to create threat. So after e takes d5, bishop g5, we got knight e4 blocking the queen. And then just like that, we got our pawn back. There's no more isolated pawn. And of course, the amount of pressure that we're putting, guys, look at this. Our rook could go to d1 after. The amount of pressure that we're putting is just so much. Now, just for the sake of testing your tactical abilities, let me show you how the game continued. Just the next 2-3 moves, okay? So we have g6 preventing us from getting to h7, queen h4. We continue to put pressure. And after queen c7, look at this bishop. It switches again from this diagonal to put pressure on f7. So bishop b3, h5, and now, guys, queen e4 comes in trying to collect on g6. There's a pin. We're trying to get the free pawn. However, after king g7 taking care of that threat, there's another tactic, and I want to see if at this point you can pause the video and find the best move. And even if this is just too difficult for you, try to at least come up with the top 3 candidate moves. 3 moves that come to mind that you think we should consider. Now, for those of you who found the right move and you calculated the whole thing, congrats. But for those of you who didn't, let's do this. I'm going to show you guys the move, and then try to pause the video after you know the first move and try to come up with the justification. Why did they do that move? What's the follow-up? The move is going to be bishop f7, just exposing that king, and after king takes, see if you can come up with the follow-up. Now, if you thought of queen e6, not quite, the king could just hide. Instead, we have this very powerful move, bishop h6. And guys, this is a move that I like a lot because typically when we do tactics, most of those exercises, they require us to find forcing variations, check, check, check. And the truth is that many times we need to find moves like this, just concepts like cutting the king from going back to hiding. And here, of course, now we're ready to do queen e6 checkmate. But it's not only e6, it's also d5, it's also c4, it's that diagonal. And there's one video that I put, one lesson that I put of me playing on Title Tuesday where I talked about these diagonal checks to prevent the king from hiding. So after bishop a6, we got queen d6, but then of course we go queen c4, then king f8, and then the only piece that is doing nothing, we bring it into the game to hit the queen. And with the queen gone, this is going to be just too easy. Guys, this is very important. Don't think that every combination has to be forcing. It's just about being energetic, gaining tempos, activating pieces. And like I always say, when your pieces are active, tactics are going to be in the air. So after knight d4, they have to give us material because otherwise they get checkmated. We get the material back. And after rook c5, this is very interesting because the white pieces did one move that made the black pieces resign. But guys, you're going to see that here Petrosian did pawn h4, which is the third best move. But he missed moves like knight g5, throwing rook e6. He missed b4, hitting the rook and making it go away. So this shows you how even powerful players cannot be as accurate as the engine. And it's not that I want you to, we shouldn't be comparing ourselves to an engine, but I still wanted to show you that. So here after h4, it is just too much, guys. The black pieces resign. So with that said, I hope that by now you know how to play against the isolated pawn, you know how to play with it, and this is going to get us ready to go deeper into the Sicilian defense. Guys, a lot of you keep asking me, when are we going to go over the Nimzo Indian or this other opening? In this course, the plan is to go through all of the openings, but I need you to know specific things, to have specific foundations before we can fully understand those openings. So with that said, I'm going to leave it here, and I will see you on lesson 154 to go deeper into the Sicilian defense.